Marine protected areas and social impact assessment. What is social impact assessment? Social impact assessment is the process of analyzing, monitoring, and managing the intended and unintended social consequences, both positive and negative, of planned interventions and any social change processes invoked by those interventions. Recognize that the social impact assessment is not just a report or a product of a study. Instead, it is a process of management. What are social impacts? Social impacts are changes to one or more of the following: the people's way of life, their culture, their community, their political system, their environment, their health and well-being, their personal and property rights, even their fears and aspirations. It's all about what is going to change. What does a social impact assessment include? The SIA will have to describe what is the project or MPA, its goals and operational features such as the location and boundaries, the proposed rules and enforcement arrangements, etc. It will have to describe the legal frameworks and standards involved in setting up and managing a marine protected area. Before determining the possible impacts, there must be a baseline description of the community. This will be used as a reference point to measure the change or impact that the MPA has on the community. It should also describe the methodology of the social research that will be conducted in determining and analyzing the potential impacts. This is to ensure that the social impact assessment was conducted without bias for the implementing agency, which often is the one that pays for the SIA and the consultants. After identifying the potential impacts, the SIA should draft mitigation plans to reduce risks and measures to manage inevitable residual impacts. In case the worst-case scenario does occur, the SIA will also draft contingency plans to respond to the community needs, to reduce impacts, or recover lost resources. Agreed community engagement and governance arrangements must be included in the SIA draft. The monitoring plan for the compliance of the implementing agency to these plans and arrangements will need to be explicitly mentioned. How do we assess and address impacts? What impacts do we include? How do we analyze potential impacts? How do we address the risks? It is important to identify various pathways of change and impacts. The MPA will entail social change processes by providing rules that change behaviors. Limiting fishing ground areas can have a direct impact on their fishing practice and can have an immediate impact in loss of economic income. Moving to another area for fish, the fishers may need to change their target fish catch, which is a second-order change. This will require them to change their fishing gears. That will have a direct impact on their budget. The change in fishing gears may require a change in terms of fishing time from day to night, which is a higher order of change. The impact may no longer be economic, but a change in family dynamics and social interactions of the fisher. As such, we recognize various direct and higher order changes and impacts in the SIA. On the other hand, the MPA can have an impact on the biophysical aspect. A decrease in fishing pressure can lead to an increase in fish stock, which can have a direct impact on people. The spillover effect is a secondary change that has an impact on humans. The improved health of the ecosystem becomes a higher order change, and the impact can have multiple impacts on people. The landscape filter recognizes that the change in the coral ecosystem can have an impact on the seagrass ecosystem and the mangrove ecosystem, and even the coastal terrestrial system. These impacts can have an indirect impact on humans. Furthermore, there can be invoked impacts. The improved or worsened economic conditions can promote in-migration or out-migration of people in the community. The increased fish stock and the reduced number of fishers who have shifted to alternative livelihoods such as tourism can create a vacuum that attracts small fisherfolk from neighboring communities or even commercial fishers. These should also be included in the potential impacts in the SIA. After identifying the potential impacts, we prioritize risks. The classical formula of risk is equal to the likelihood multiplied by impact. Likelihood can be in the form of how frequent can the identified impact occur. Every day, every peak season, every time there is a change in mayor, every El Nino cycle, every time there is a pandemic or when the tourism industry collapses. On the other hand, impact can be measured in terms of how many people are affected, how large is the potential fish stock, how small or large an area is affected. The team can define means to quantify these likelihoods and impacts together with the community. This straightforward formula can be immediately used to prioritize which risks need to be paid more attention to and which ones can be absorbed by the project. Often, the likelihoods versus impact can be plotted for more visual presentation. Impacts at the higher right-hand corner deserves high priority. Those diagonally in the middle deserves medium priority, while those at the lower left-hand corner may be low priority. Some may even consider these as collateral damage. How do we address the risks? Making changes to the project or plan to avoid the adverse effects is the most acceptable form of mitigation. Where avoidance is not possible, adverse effects can be reduced during the designing or the setting up process. Where adverse effects cannot be reduced further, measures can be introduced to limit their influence by restoring, rehabilitating, or remediating the affected environment. Where new benefits are not possible and there are still residual impacts, it may be appropriate to provide compensatory measures that attempt to offset the adverse effects with a comparable positive one. Where compensating in kind is not possible, then as a last resort, attempt can be made to compensate by other means. But such an approach in identifying risk is very hazard-oriented. Is there an alternative approach that is more people-centered? An alternative definition of risks is when vulnerable communities and biophysical elements are exposed to hazards. The formula of risk times exposure times vulnerability is often presented and sometimes used in geographic information systems to identify high-risk and low-risk areas. But graphically, the intersection of hazards, risks, and vulnerabilities transforms how we conceptualize risks. There's now more consciousness of vulnerability of people that can range from people's poverty, level of marginalization, or level of awareness of risks. The exposure provides a spatial or geographic dimension to risks. By doing so, our risk reduction strategies are not limited to mitigating the hazards or the design of the MPAs or providing engineering solutions. Minimizing exposure, relocation, or evacuation during times of crisis can be an option to reduce risks. By adding the vulnerability component, we can prioritize vulnerable groups. We can have interventions that directly address their sources of vulnerability. We can develop their capacity. We can improve their preparedness capacity. We can protect their human rights if this is a source of their direct or indirect vulnerability. We can even transfer risks through insurance. Recall that in socio-ecological systems, we recognize that communities and social systems are coupled, interdependent, and co-evolutionary with the environment and the ecological systems. While this seems obvious, the implications are quite deep, and we often unconsciously believe in the counter-narrative. The counter-narrative is that people are against nature. Our analysis is that people are stressors and primarily degrade the environment and the natural resources. increasing population leads to increased demands and overfishing. Strategies are often top-down and controlling, instilling fear and enforcing policies to ensure people are disciplined to manage their natural resources. We blame government for problems and its lack of political will. We demand strong leaders from the local government units and presume that they will make the right policies that will tell people how to manage resources sustainably. We push for alternative livelihoods that will disconnect communities from the resources, as if this is possible at all. We work to get people's buy-in to projects in order to mask our top-down approach in implementing already approved projects. We instill fear with strict penalties in the name of disciplining people to follow evidence-based policies. Success is dictated by indicators showing how outputs are delivered, rules are followed, or the number of violators apprehended. As a corollary, studying social impact assessment of marine protected areas under hazard management is actually looking at MPAs as hazards to people. This may not be the intent of this topic, but the overall framing from a project point of view points to this direction. In contrast, the humans in nature approach or the social ecological systems approach requires more complex analysis, strategies, and goals. The analysis is that in particular places, there are two-way relationships between people and nature, and this relationship covers multiple disciplines, multiple scales from the microspecies level and individuals to populations and national levels. Strategies will require participatory resource and knowledge management, adaptive management, learning by doing, co-management practices, and multiple approaches. This implies processes of trial and error and experiencing failure to strengthen the learnings that will consolidate community and collective learning. This implies their participation in critical decision-making processes. Yes, this will be a time-consuming process, but through their participation in iterative policy making, communities will comply and promote collective action because they believe in the wisdom of policies and their power as change agents, and not because they fear penalties. The goals are more profound. Not specific indicators, but systemic goals such as maintaining health and quality of people and the environment, holistic well-being, food security, sustainable development, resilience to disasters, resilience to poverty. This becomes extremely challenging, especially if we view ourselves as mere implementers of projects or institutions. But we have to recognize that communities will continue after a project and will undergo several projects in its lifetime. Resilience is built and measured in decades, not project cycles. So if we contextualize this in project development, we recognize that community participation must be installed in all crucial decision-making processes in the development of a marine protected area. The International Association of Public Participation reminds us of the spectrum of public participation goals and the commitments we have as duty bearers from government or from social development agencies. The purpose of public participation is not merely to inform, consult, and involve people, but to move towards effective collaboration and empowerment. Any questions?